Welcome to Debat Awani. You are watching this live on the premises of International Islamic University, Malaysia in Gombak. And while we are shooting this live on location, you are also watching a sub-series of Debat Awani, the fourth public debate, IIU debate series, co-organized by the Ministry of Youth and Sports, as well as the International Islamic Malaysia, and we are proud at Astro Awani here to be the official broadcaster of this debate series. This time round, we shall try to untangle the very nasty business of GLCs, GLICs, and that role it has with the Malaysian government. On this premise, we have asked people at home and all around the globe, for that matter, whether or not they agree that whether or not the Malaysian government should continue its dependence or should limit its involvement with the government-linked companies to garner more economic drivers and more economic growth. With that, before the debate started, we have taken a poll. 64% of you actually agreed that we should limit the dependency of the GLCs in generating revenue and economic growth for the government, while 34% of you disagreed and saying that we shouldn't limit, continue as it is. So that was before the debate happened. Of course, tonight, as the event will progress, and we'll see four fantastic speakers trying to see what is the argument that is going to be put forward on whether or not we should limit or should not limit the dependency of the government on GLCs. Hopefully you can change your mind, because after the debate ends, we're going to reopen the debate yet again, the polls, and you can vote based on the debate that progressed on this platform this evening, whether or not we have indeed changed your mind or whether you have stuck to your guns. Joining me four very accomplished speakers. We shall introduce each and every one of them just before they speak, but before we start, let me introduce the rows among the very thorny debaters. Up front here, we have Nurhana, the debater or undergraduate from UIA itself. She is the third-year economics student. She has participated at the World Universities Debating Championship, or WUDC 2019, and has gone all the way to the quarterfinals there. With that in mind, Hannah, you have the floor on opening the debate.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? GLCs initially are meant to be public enterprises. They're meant to help a lot of the disenfranchised people like Bumi Putras. However, in status quo, GLCs no longer serve their purpose. In fact, oftentimes GLCs become a problematic form of corporation. I think that it's best that we limit our dependencies on them. But before I start, let us first clarify what GLCs are, because I'm pretty sure most of us don't know. GLC, the definition of GLC, I cannot specifically tell you, because oftentimes there is no clear definition of how many percentage the government should own prior to it being calling GLC. And I'll tell you later why that in and of itself is a problem. But essentially, it's when the government holds majority shares and holds stake inside a certain company. What this means is that the government, number one, is able to actually decide on the direction of the company. There we go. Decide on the direction of the company. Secondly, it means that they decide the financing of the company in and of itself. And this is all what government have the capacity to decide on. And thirdly, it also means that the appointment of management is also upon the government in and of itself. Now, this is extremely harmful. These GLCs look like, for example, Khazanah and Petronas, which is fully government-owned, or companies like Mara and Felda, which governments hold more than 50% of shares in and of itself. The issues with this are for a few reasons. Number one, there is no internal audit function for these GLCs to begin with. And secondly, there is no annual aggregate input, report. So what that means is that whatever the GLCs do is not likely to be regulated by the government in and of itself. And the problem is that it's not likely to even have the political will for us to start regulating GLCs, because obviously the government is going to reap less benefits the point in which we regulate them. So this is the primary issue. Note that all of these issues stem from one thing: the lack of regulation upon and placed on GLCs. Side opposition has to debate inside a world in which these GLCs look like this and not in its purest form, because it's unlikely for the way GLCs are behaving to change anytime soon. What is the ideal world coming from side government? We would prefer a world that looks like this. The first is for us to have an act in order for us to be able to better regulate GLCs. This means that, number one, in that act, we have to be able to define GLCs. Why is this extremely important? We have to say how many % of shares that government owns inside these companies for them to be considered GLCs. We also have to decide whether or not indirect ownership or proxy ownership over these companies by the government is considered GLCs. Defining GLCs in and of itself means that now you are able to actually decide which companies are bound under this act and are bound under this regulation. Because imagine, currently, we have no idea what exactly GLCs are. That means most of them get away with a lot of things, and only some of them are like bound by acts like the Competition Act. The regulation currently is not good enough. Now, secondly, this act ought to include things like, for example, tracking procurement activities. What does this mean? It means that you have to regulate who and what the companies can actually buy from. Because this is room for example, cronyism, especially when people from the government and political appointees are also part of the management of these companies, right? Under the current context, GLCs bring several harms. What are these harms? The first is that GLCs are just no longer relevant. If it's true that GLCs are meant to help like disenfranchised groups, for example, the Boomies, you have to understand a lot of the people that GLCs are aiming to help, like for example, Mara, are now already helped. This looks like, for example, 70% of Malays are now in urban areas. So side opposition needs to tell me who exactly these GLCs are helping and why necessarily these GLCs are still relevant in today's status quo. The second is things like, for example, these GLCs are like no longer act in national interest because they oftentimes now exist as profit-oriented companies. They now look for where exactly they can invest and what can bring most money to them, and rather than helping a lot of the people that they initially wanted to help. And this is precisely what GLCs have become, because there is oftentimes the need to make money from GLCs because we are so dependent on them for our economy to function. Now, let's assume that GLCs are in their purest form. There is no corruption involved in GLCs, and in fact, we are able to regulate them. Why side government is still not okay with like our economy fully depending on GLCs? This is for a few reasons. The first is the issue of crowding out. What is crowding out? So essentially what happens when GLCs control the economy, and we are so dependent on them, it means that you block space from private corporations or private investments to actually enter the market. Now, this is extremely harmful because private corporations are oftentimes the people, number one, they are not bound by taxpayer money. That means they are able to invest in more risky places. This looks like, for example, they are also able to, for example, innovate in a lot of places. For example, our automobile industry. Having more private corporations inside places like this means there is a higher likelihood that these corporations are actually going to innovate in a lot of these industries. I think our industries are going to look better in this specific form. But secondly, the issue with GLCs, even in their purest form, is because oftentimes governments are obligated to bail them out the point in which these companies fail. And this is extremely harmful. Why is this so? Because when we are so dependent on our GLCs to begin with, the minute our GLCs fail, for example, they're not bringing enough revenue or they don't have enough profit, what's going to happen is that the government is going to use our taxpayer money to bail out these corporations at the end of the day. And I think this is extremely harmful for a lot of the people on the ground. Because when private corporations are unable to actually back up that industry when there is no other corporations, it means that the industry is likely to fail because there's no other alternative. But secondly, it also means a lot of the government money is going to be spent on us backing up these GLCs the minute that they fail. And this is precisely what happens when we have full dependencies on GLCs. I think a world in which we allow at least private companies to exist, number one, we live in a world in which there are more corporations that are actually regulated. But secondly, it also means there is more of a cushion in the event in which companies fail. Side with government. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. So as you can see, that was the first youth speaker. So how this debate will progress is that we'll have two youth speakers coming up first. They will speak for 7 minutes the way Hannah would speak. And then after that, we'll have what we call the master class coming in. And Firdaos and then Prof Terence will then come in and sweep them up, I suppose. So now we shall invite Khalis to the floor. Khalis, of course, is a very prominent speaker in the realm of IIUM debating. He's the third-year law student. As a debater, he's a champion of the Asian BP or British Parliamentary Debate Championship last year. And he's a finalist at the World's Universities Debating Championship in South Africa. So how's that for pedigree? Khalis, you have the floor.
Hello? 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 Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Ibrahim. Ladies and gentlemen, a private company is designed with the specific intention to earn profit. It is beholden to its shareholders, it is beholden to its board of directors, it is beholden to the broader idea of a money-making agenda. A GLC, on the other hand, is designed with the intention to help the rakyat. It is designed with the sole intention to place profit before the people. And that is the key distinction that this proposition side has missed. That the GLCs are uniquely purposed to serve the people, whilst private corporations merely serve the hands of the market. This proposition side is ignorant of the good that GLCs have done. Say, the millions of scholarships that Mara has provided to poor children, the hundreds of millions in financial stability that the PNB has provided for pensioners via schemes like Amanah Saham, or even the hundreds of thousands of homes that Felda has provided in rural areas like Kelantan. And for those reasons, we stand for the firm idea that GLCs should, in fact, be a prominent figure in this economy. There will be two issues broadly in my speech. Firstly, how GLCs and only GLCs will be able to help those rural people. Secondly, on corruption, transparency, and accountability. Before that, just some clarification to make in this debate. First, we agree with the vast majority of things coming from the previous speaker. We agree that regulations would be great. We think that there is an urgent need to define GLCs properly, and we think that that's all things we can have under our side of the house as well. Secondly, an extraneous issue about bailouts. We think that this harm is symmetrical, i.e., we believe that bailouts will still happen in their side of the house. Ladies and gentlemen, what was the largest bailout in the history of mankind? It was not to Khazanah National Berhad, it was to Goldman Sachs and Bear Stearns, i.e. private companies which required bailouts as well. Those things are not innate or inherent to GLCs. That was frankly uncomparative coming from their side of the house. Firstly, GLCs and the rural poor. I want to be clear about priority here. Hannah apparently thinks that there is no one to help in rural areas like Kelantan and Pahang, and etc., and so on and so forth. It is not just the boomies we are talking about here, but rather the silent majority of the poor who need help across those areas. That should be the primary locus of this debate. It should not be about transforming Malaysia into an economic powerhouse. It should be about getting the base level of care for these people. With that regard, we think GLCs do some very important things. This debate has to be about who helps the struggling breadwinner in Kelantan as he or she no longer lives paycheck to paycheck or even obtain a paycheck. In this regard, how exactly do GLCs help? Note a statistic. GLCs have managed to transform Malaysians' poverty rate from a staggering 60% to 0.6% currently in Malaysia within a span of 3 decades. I think that that is something that should be continued insofar as it helps multiple people, millions of people across Malaysia. And how exactly did it happen, ladies and gentlemen? It was the creation of Felda with a principle of giving opportunities to the landless and homeless in Kuantan and Terengganu. It was loans to small corporations and small businesses that were sprouting up. It was houses to put roofs across over families. And not coincidentally developing Malaysia into the largest global player in the oil palm industry in the world. It was the creation of Mara that created scholarships to send students to top universities around the world. It's the production of successful graduates through MRSM and UiTM. It was the creation of the second most successful English debating club in Malaysia.
Oh.
The first is IIUM, guys.
There you go.
Applause. But more importantly, note the contrast with the incentives of what a private market provides. Because they'll never be able to pay to give out loans, to give out free homes to the poor people who need them. Because poor people will never be able to pay. Poor people will never be able to pay high interest rates for these loans. Only governments who can take up the cost, who can take up the brunt, who can run in deficit will be able to provide the loans that these poor people need. There's an element of altruism, key to nation building, innate to GLCs, key in determining the structural fabric of our nation, and we think that's far preferable compared to their world. We reject the idea that companies need more loans. We think that on a base level, we should still help the people who need it. Secondly, with corruption, transparency, and accountability. This proposition side identifies political appointments, cronyism, and procurement as things they no longer want, ignorant of the fact that corruption pervades in the free market as well. This proposition side defends a world where the rules are inherently set by companies with no other goal than to make profit. Allow me to illustrate. In the 2008 financial crisis, a total of 16 banks were found to have lent rural areas, rural homeowners, mortgage loans with extremely high interest rates. When they did not pay back, the studies indicated that a 16% increase in the rate of homelessness. That's a grand total of 70 million people taken advantage of by the free market. 70 million people who would have been better off had a US GLC been there to procure houses for them, or at least loans for them at a reasonable interest rate. Couple that with the endemic problem of companies paying off politicians to serve their interests in the realm of economics. Amazon paid a whopping 0% of their profits in taxes to the US government in 2018. Apple paid a measly sum compared to their vast billions in profits across the world. Contrast that with the taxes levied on Khazanah and PNB and other GLCs redistributed back to the entire populace across Malaysia. And the reason why that happened under their side of the house is the widespread political influence that will still exist across companies, even if companies are no longer government-linked. Given the relative similarity, what then is the difference, ladies and gentlemen? The difference is, under our side of the house, with a government-linked company, power lies in the hands of the people, i.e., we have the power to hold companies accountable. That power lies in you. That power lies in me. That power lies in everyone in this hall to be able to kick out any politician who ends up being appointed into this GLC. That is the unique difference under our side of the house, the ability to keep corporations accountable. It's fantastic that this debate is happening. It's fantastic that political appointments and corruption is being peppered across news outlets, because that belies a level of transparency involved with GLCs. We know who's accountable. We know who is doing a bad job, taking charge of these companies. And that only happens in a world where all these things are transparent, only with GLCs. Contrast that again with a world where corruption happens not in front of your face, not when it's visible, but rather behind a veil of ignorance. We said that world is preferable. That is your internal audit, Hannah. So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, before I end my speech, I just want to thank the reaction team, Nazim, Suhaila, Madam Aliza, for making this happen. My best friends, Nazim again, Sharif, Kishan, if you're watching this at home, and of course, my parents. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Khalis. He has debunked a few myths. One of them is that debaters can actually be funny during a debate. We will have the master speakers coming up right after this break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Debat Awani. This is the 4th IIUM Public Debate Series, co-organized by the Ministry of Youth and Sports, as well as the International Islamic University, Malaysia, where this debate is currently being held. We are proud to sponsor the show by way of being the official broadcaster at Astro Awani. Just now, you saw the youth speakers presenting their opening arguments for whether or not the Malaysian government should continue, depending on the government-linked companies or GLCs, to be the driver for economic growth. We shall now move on to the main speakers on both sides and to hear the arguments presented by both. We shall start with side proposition. On my right is Mr. Firdaos Rosli. He is the current Director of Economics, Trade and Regional Integration at ISIS, also known as the Institute of Strategic and International Studies. Previously, in 2004, he was, there was a quick chuckle there. He was the Assistant Director in the MITI, or the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, where he also assisted as the Deputy MITI Minister as the Senior Private Secretary since 2008. Mr. Firdaus, you have the floor.
Hi, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Let me start with telling you a story. I was fortunate enough to deliver a presentation to the cabinet in 2015, and one of the questions that was asked was that, what is the future of Proton? And as an analyst back then, I said that Proton should be already on their knees, if not already. And true enough, a few months after that presentation, Proton asked for a 1.5 billion ringgit worth of soft loan from the government. But then again, have we forgotten that Proton is no longer a GLC then? After 2012, DRB acquired Proton, and Proton is effectively not under the purview of Khazanah, no longer. My friends, my dear friends and colleagues, it is not hard to debate issues concerning GLCs in Malaysia. We often hear about the crowding out effect, which my esteemed colleague has already very eloquently delivered it to you. But this is actually even more than that. It is not just about the effect on private investment. It's not even on the impact of income and wealth inequality, governance, etc. But the fundamental question that we cannot still answer with regards to GLC today is that, have we truly defined what is GLC? Ladies and gentlemen, GLC, as we know it, is a corporate entity who's supposed to be an extension of public policy. Well, they might be private, they may be public, they may be listed. Again, we don't know what is the extent of GLC today. So the thing is, some broad definitions is that the effective controlling interest of more than 50%, or any corporate entity that has government as a shareholder or major shareholder of any of the GLCs. Some suggest that 35 public listed companies in Malaysia, in terms of market capitalization, or 42% of the entire Bursa Malaysia companies. There is a Putrajaya Committee on GLC, high performance, and the definition is that by control rather than percentage ownership. Now, ladies and gentlemen, again, what is the definition of GLC? The problem we have today is that there is no one act that can truly define all this. There's no one analyst also that can never truly define this. Point number two that I will make today is that without a clear definition of GLCs, should they involve in almost every single commercial activities that we have today? Let me name you some type of, a number of types of industries that they involve in Malaysia, particularly in the services industry. They exist in agriculture, aerospace, aviation, transportation, logistics, financial services, banking, pharmaceutical, infrastructure, construction, and the list goes on and on. But since services sector accounts for 56% of Malaysia GLCs, who knows what is the real extent? Again, I mentioned the word construction. So if I were to put in the construction industry, which accounts for 4.2% of Malaysia's GDP, and again, I mentioned the word agriculture, which is 7.9% of Malaysia's GDP. Again, they will probably account for much larger than the numbers that I just shown you. So since we are pushing for another, well, third car project, can you imagine? I mentioned the word services, I did not mention the word manufacturing. If manufacturing were to be accounted as part of the GLC, effectively, they account for almost everything that we live. So their global exposure is also high. In the case of Khazanah National, 45% of their realizable asset value is located overseas, particularly in Singapore, Turkey, and China. Petronas has global presence too, particularly in North America, as well as West Asia too. So, just to give you a snapshot about how big our investments abroad, okay? The net outflow of direct investment abroad of Malaysian companies overseas is at least 22.1 billion a year since 2006 until this very day. And with over ½ trillion ringgit, well, we talk about trillion a lot these days, right? With ½ trillion ringgit of DIA position abroad, which is in an increasing trend since 2001, who knows how much exactly is their presence abroad. As such, our GLCs are also risking their investments abroad, and these are our money, public money. And they are also exposed to a number of external risks, such as currency, change in policies, changes in administrations, weather conditions, and so on. So the question is, are they in favor of shareholders or stakeholders, people like you and me? My friends, my dear friends and colleagues, the dominance of GLCs, my third point, my dominance of GLCs in the Malaysian economy blurs the line between regulator and the player. In the case of Petronas, they are the regulator as well as the player, because we do not have the minister for oil and gas, unlike Norway and unlike quite a number of countries in West Asia. In case of automotive, manufacturing, because of the overprotection of Proton and Proton, our local champions, there is no manufacturing license can be given out to car assemblers and manufacturers of cars with 1.5 liter engine and below. In the case of fixed broadband, TM is a major player, even until this very day, with Time.com, again, another major player, which is GLC. Bernas, a sole importer of rice in this country. And again, they are a state trading agency, and there's no other entity in Malaysia that have that right. Prima, supposedly the custodian of affordable housing. Are they really affordable? And what happens when the government intervene directly in the economy? Private players, private construction companies move up the scale, and guess what happens to the overhang status that we have today? Point number 4, the entrenched position of GLCs in the economy means that it's going to be hard for us to undertake market-led reforms. We do not have a clear market-led reforms for a very, very long time now, even I would easily say decades. Thus, this country may be over-defensive in their industry development moving forward, which means that as Malaysia grow, we will be neither a champion in one nor a laggard in another industry. So, we cannot grow as much as others, and we will not be worse off as much as others during economic crisis. But then again, have you forgotten, as a result of government intervention in the automotive industry, it took us 15 years to comply with AFTA under the CEPT, Common Effective Preferential Tariff Scheme. Have you forgotten about that? As a result, we shift the burden of tariff liberalization to non-tariff liberalization. And in fact, we even freeze the manufacturing license just to give up some space for our local champions to grow in the future. We are the latecomer in the institutionalizing the competition law, unlike our own neighbors, like Thailand in 1979, Indonesia, 1984, Vietnam and Singapore in 2004, and Malaysia only have our own competition law in 2010. My dear friends and colleagues, the point number 5 I'm saying today is that the impact of all this is being felt at the consumer level. Prices of cars. I do not have to mention anything about that because, I'm sure all of you have cars. Rice. Almost every pack of rice has a Bernas chop on it. Almost all of them. Can we buy directly at a market rate? Broadband prices, housing. What is affordable housing? And what is affordable anyway? Affordable housing in Kuala Lumpur or Klang Valley is not the same as affordable housing in areas like Kelantan, Muka, Miri, and even Kapit. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to reiterate here that we must clearly define what is GLC. And with that, we could start, and I say could, we could start with having an act, a law, a legislation to govern GLCs. Right now, we have nothing. The problem is that if once we do that, then things will start to be a little bit clearer, and there will be an easier space for us to define what is in the interest of the, what is in the national interest versus what is the interest of shareholders. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Firdaus. Finally, we shall have the main speaker from side opposition. He's a rather distinguished individual. Professor Edmund Terence Gomez is a professor of the Faculty of Economics and Administration at the University of Malaya. He was the senior fellow at IDEAS, or the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs. Of course, previously he had a role at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development back in 2005. But one of the reasons why he's one of the more talked about academics in the country is because of his book entitled Minister of Finance Incorporated, Ownership and Control of Corporate Malaysia, which is a pioneering assessment of government-linked investment companies. Perhaps the best person to talk about this topic this evening. Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you. It is cumbersome to hear this word. We don't know what GLC, it's not well defined. They keep saying it. It's well defined. Read my book. Now, let me say this. The problem with them is that they have gone and homogenized everything as GLCs. But what exactly are GLCs? Let me de-homogenize them. There are statutory bodies. Statutory bodies which are important are like MARA, FELDA. Then there are GLICs, that's like EPF, Tabung Haji. Then we have foundations, Yayasan Pelaburan Bumiputra. Then we have holding companies, MOF Inc., Minister of Finance Incorporated. Don't they make any distinction of these different types of GLCs? Why did they go and homogenize all of them and call them GLCs when they all do different things? And then they come here and they say there are no laws, we have to govern them properly. There are laws. Statutory bodies are governed by law. The GLCs are governed by the Companies Act. The question they should ask is, why is it that these laws are ineffective? And the reason why these laws are ineffective is because the institutions that govern them have been captured by politicians. So please don't come and blame GLCs when politicians abuse the GLCs, when politicians don't let oversight institutions cover them and ensure that they do their work properly. So let me make things easier for them. I've already defined GLCs for you. Let me now do the second thing. The reason why they're so blur about what GLCs are, how important they are, is because they don't know their history. It is unfortunate that you can come here for a debate and you negate any understanding of how the GLCs evolved. I'll take you through 4 stages in history so you know what happened. The most important date for us was 13th May 1969. We had a crisis. At that point in time, we realized we had to do something. And they created the new economic policy. The new economic policy was a policy that transformed the way government functioned. To allow the government to intervene to redress the problems that were exposed in May 1969, they created what was called public enterprises, later renamed collectively GLCs. These public enterprises, as Kalis has just pointed out, did great things. Mara built schools, went to the kampongs, took the poor kids, gave them high quality education from young to university level, and created a new Bumiputra middle class in 20 years. That was a miracle. No other country have I seen in the world where they have lifted people out of poverty within just 20 years and created a new middle class. Felda, they took poor people, gave them land, and made poor people landed middle class. So successful was Felda that the World Bank called them a model company. And here they are coming and telling us, get rid of them. PNB. PNB was created to allow poor people to invest in that investment fund, and that investment fund went and acquired companies, especially foreign companies. And let me remind you, in 1969, 60% of the corporate sector was owned by foreigners. Bumiputras owned only 2%. With PNB's help, there was a major shift in equity distribution. By the end of the 1990s, when the NEP ended, Bumiputra corporate equity was up to 19%. These are major transformations. A revolutionary transformation transpired. Have you all forgotten your history? And now you come here before me and you tell me, get rid of it. If they want to get rid of it, what is their... If they want to get rid of it, hold on. If they want to get rid of it, you had your chance, you can debate it later. If you want to get rid of it, what is their recommendation? Their recommendation is very simple, privatize it. So let me take you to the second point in history, 1990. In 1990, there was the shift. Let's privatize. Corporate Melayu. Let's create a new capitalist class. And between 1990 and 1996, they did it. They transferred much of these GLCs into the hands, private hands. And you know what happened? In 1997, we had an Asian crisis. The whole thing collapsed, and the government had to go in and bail out all these private companies, and suddenly all these private firms became GLCs again. And now they're telling me they want to repeat what they did in 1990. Don't they know their history? The third important moment, when Abdullah Ahmad Badawi became Prime Minister, he looked upon the state and he said, look, okay, we have a lot of GLCs. We got to revamp them. And he introduced the the GLC transformation program. And the GLC transformation program was a very effective program. After transforming the GLCs and bringing about major changes from the period between 2000 to today, if you look at the top 10 companies in the country today, 8 of them are GLCs. There's no way over the past 20 years you could have remained in the top 10 consistently if you're so badly run. And if they're so well run, why do you want to privatize them when you already know in the past it failed? The fourth point in history, and this is very important, we had a change of government, and we had a new Prime Minister, Najib Razak. Najib Razak came in and he also said, yes, we must privatize, and suddenly he stopped. He stopped talking about privatization because he suddenly realized he's sitting on a gold mine. He understood how the system worked. And being the rentier, corrupt politician that he is, he realized, why privatize when I can use the system to work in my interest? I can use this to work in my interest. And what happened? And then you have the scandals. 1MDB, Tabung Haji gets abused, LTAT gets abused, EPF is abused. Suddenly everybody is abused, and GLCs become the bad thing. Why don't you point the finger at where it should be pointed to? The politicians. So I want to come back to the issue at hand. I am not saying here that everything that they have said is all wrong. There are many things that they have said is right. When the politicians realized that they have a system here that they can abuse, what they did was the GLCs, the statutory bodies, the foundations, all began to create GLCs. And I want to make a distinction between them and the GLCs. The GLCs became a tool for the practice of patronage. politicians suddenly began to be appointed as directors of these GLCs. These GLCs, as we said, began to crowd out people. Yes, that may be true. But we didn't even need these GLCs. They were systems created to exploit the state. If they want to divest these GLCs or close them down, I'll say, go ahead. But please don't touch EPF. Please don't touch Tabung Haji, because poor people want to go and do their Hajj. Khazanah was set up to go into strategic areas. Be careful what you wish for. Who is going to do this for you? So the point here is this. What should we be debating? What we should be debating is, we should look at the structure as it stands now. How do we reform these structures to make it far more effective? Let us be clear that what we should know is there's a power system in place here. How do we ensure the power system is used for the interest of the people, not for the interest of politicians to further enrich themselves or to use it as a tool of patronage to get political support? To use the GLCs to go down to the grassroots, to give out aid and say, now you support me. That is not what the GLCs are for. They were brought in to bring about structural changes. Can you please stick to that? That should be the role. But here's the thing. Even today, after the reforms, politicians don't want to reform the system. Why? The GLCs are so opaque. That opacity allows them to abuse it. That is what we want to check. Open up the system, become transparent. That is why we are calling for reforms. But do not throw the baby out with the bathwater. That can be dangerous, especially for poor people. And remember, we still have a bottom 40%. That's 12 million people. Do not write off these poor people by hoping that businesses now who we privatize to are going to take care of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. While that was a resounding speech, in varsity debate you would have lost mark because you didn't take any POIs. But anyway, we shall now transfer the power of the youth. After this, you guys can ask the questions to these debaters. We'll go for a short break. That will happen after this.
Sorry, guys.
You're watching Debat Awani. Today we are at IIUM because this is the 4th public debate series organized or co-organized by the University of International Islamic University Malaysia as well as the Ministry of Youth and Sports, broadcast wholly and exclusively by Astro Awani. We've done with the first round of the debate, and we have also opened the Twitter poll at Reaction Youth 1. Remember, before we started the debate, when we opened the poll was actually overwhelmingly pro-government. Here, they want to limit the GLC's involvement in driving the economy of Malaysia. However, after the debate ended, you may decide for yourselves after listening to the stirring speeches of the debaters. But moving forward, because there's a literally big signboard that says #YouthPower, we shall now actually fulfill that promise and transfer the power to the youth in front of us, letting you guys to ask the questions to the debaters. We'll start off with this side, actually eager here. If you could just state your name and the questions that you would ask to the debaters.
Hi, I'm Aida Liana. I'm from IIUM. So I'd like to ask the government side, how would the market actually allocate accessibility to goods or services that are expensive, for instance, the internet? Yeah, thank you.
So Firdaus?
All right.
Would you be able to elaborate on your question again?
So how would the market, like for instance, if you limit the dependence of the economy on the government-linked companies, how are they able to actually allocate goods and services that are not accessible entirely to everyone? So for instance, like internet currently it's being subsidized, if I'm not mistaken. So how would you be able to, make it accessible for everyone and maintain the accessibility? Yeah.
Let me go back to the question of the law and legislations that we have in this country. As far as internet is concerned, it is all under the purview of Communication and Multimedia Act, if I'm not mistaken. And the Act says that it is all in the power of the minister to approve any licenses, especially when it comes to foreign licenses, in order to supply broadband or provide any kind of services within the internet internet services. So with that, since the GLC in this context, TM Malaysia, has overwhelming dominance in the economy as far as broadband is concerned, fixed broadband is concerned, then it is in the interest of the government to ensure that that continues. Unless if we want to open up to a bigger player, perhaps like Google Fiber, as what they have in the States, and other players that can offer at a much better and competitive rates than what we have today.
Okay. Shall we open the question from this side of the hall, please?
Hello. Hi, I am Aisha. I'm from IIUM. I'd like to ask a question for the opposition side. So, as far as I'm concerned, some GLCs were created to help bridge wealth and income disparities between ethnicities, specifically Bumiputras. Many say that this has caused a reliance towards it. So, how would you solve this reliance?
Crutch issue.
Thank you. When Mahathir stood down as Prime Minister in 2003, he openly admitted that the policy that he had created to try and, the Bumiputra commercial and industrial community, which he had created to try and generate a group of Bumiputra capitalists, had failed. He said, I have created a crutch mentality. These are Mahathir's words, not mine. So here's the thing. When we spoke, when you heard the debaters speaking, they mentioned, for example, Proton. And they said Proton was a massive failure. Yes, it was a failure. But where did they go wrong? What they did was, they brought in the Japanese, and they brought in HICOM, and they created a base, a vendor development program, which was catering only to Bumiputras. If they had opened it up to all, I think the Proton would probably have done far better. And in fact, why even bring in the Japanese when there were enough business people here in the country who could have very well built the car? They had already had much experience in terms of spare part manufacturing and marketing.
Okay.
So what we have learned from this is very simple. When it comes to business, Mahathir himself, by his own admission, is clear. Affirmative action in business does not work. If you want businesses to work, it should not be race-based.
Right, it's open to this side of the house again.
Okay, Assalamualaikum. My name is Nurin. I'm from IIUM, and my question is, how do government effectively coordinate fiscal and monetary policies as a response to recession if they can't influence the local economy?
Okay. Yep.
Here's the thing. The problem often arises when we are confronted with economic crisis. Remember when we had our first real crisis, the commodity crisis in the mid 1980s. It was largely because of commodity, and at that time, what the government respond to that is to liberalize the manufacturing sector, and from there you see a lot of tech companies mostly, as E&E companies flourish and come into Malaysia. But in the 1997 crisis, what happened was that instead of us liberalizing the economy so that market forces can adjust itself and reform parts of market failures. Instead of that happening, we jump in and created Dana Modal and then Dana Harta to recap many of these banks. And what happened to trade then? Our reliance to trade has gone down, and then it has even gone down even more after the global financial crisis. So to put it succinctly, every time when we are confronted with economic crisis, we often say, okay, that's it, we're going to jump in, and then you guys do not be afraid, because I will save you. But the problem is that when you put your hands too much into the jar, when it's time for you to put it out, it might be a bit too late.
Right, this side of the house.
Hi, my name is Anik from IIUM. And in a book by Dr. Mahathir, a doctor in the house, he says that given the amount of money poured inside GLCs, the benefits to Bumiputras are unjustifiably small and unequally distributed. So the question is, wouldn't GLCs be complacent when they are dependent on the government assistance rather than needing to be sustainable on their own?
Yep, so the question is, how do we manage something that came out from Hadi's book?
To answer the question, let me go back to how I started my debate. I want to make a distinction between GLCs, statutory bodies, investment funds. I would agree with Mahathir on certain things. GLCs, I felt, in some sectors, was a mistake. And one of the reasons why they were a mistake also, it was because it was ethnically based, it was patronage based. Another reason why it was a mistake, it was because it was selective patronage too. So Mahathir must take the blame for many of the things that went wrong. Mahathir himself recognized, as I said, and I don't know why he didn't bring it up in his book, that he had created a crutch mentality, and that crutch mentality is the reason why we have this problem that you just mentioned. Why is Mahathir abdicating responsibility when he was a prime mover for that kind of selective patronage? I do believe if Mahathir had given some of these contracts to people based on merit, the outcomes would have been different. And in some cases, we wouldn't even have needed GLCs to do it. Let me end by saying this. What is the purpose of state intervention in the economy? It is to nurture a vibrant domestic capitalist class. It is to nurture vibrant, dynamic companies. The only way you can do it is if you give it to people who have the know-how. You don't have to bring GLCs into this. That's why, as I said, not everything that they said was wrong. So Mahathir has to take responsibility. I think he's being very selective in his memory in terms of also how he saw the outcomes of this GLCs.
Therefore, we shall move on to the next question on this side of the house.
I am Abdullah. I'm from IIUM. Knowing that the new public management couldn't work because of such kind of limits, the government shouldn't do that or shouldn't work with this. My question is, how in 2019 would you believe that throwing us back in the 1980s, a private investor, especially who is not from the country, can take care of the citizens, eyeing the government failures? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Now, you see, it goes back to the main topic of our debate today, which is limit the dependence of GLCs in the economy. We did not say to eliminate them. We say that there is a way, and there must be a way for us to limit their dominance in the economy. Because we do, again, as I mentioned in my in the previous section, is that the line is now blurred. What is in the interest of the nation and what is in the interest of the shareholders? More often than not, commercial interests cannot be in the interest of the nation. That's why when things happen, there's a thing called bailout. So that word is very, very wrong, because we are not bailing out to ensure that to ensure that market will adjust by itself, to ensure that the failure will continue to dominate the economy.
That's right. Okay. Shall we open the question here?
Hello, my name is Iqbal. I'm from IIUM. So, opposition tried to distinguish the fact that we should blame the politicians more rather than blaming on the GLCs themselves in cases of corruption. But then we can't deny the fact that when they are government-funded companies, politicians would have a great dominance in that companies. And when that situation happens, like the case of 1MDB scandal, investors start to lose interest in investing in Malaysia. So why should we take the risk of allowing these politicians control companies to be dependent by the economic growth of Malaysia? Some sort of. Thank you.
Right.
Hello? Yeah. Thanks for the question. I think the idea in my speech is that there will be a large similarity in the world of a free market in terms of corruption. The difference is that there's something innately visible about the nature of GLCs which allows some level of accountability. If it is true that the scenario and context of Malaysia is so corrupt such that every politician is being appointed and stealing money from corporations, if that is true, it may be true, then there's no reason why that won't happen, albeit in a more refined form in the private market. But the point here is that the distinction is that in a world where you can call out the politician who is appointed, in a world where you can vote out the government who engages in activities like this, that's better than a world where you're ignorant of it happening versus it being right in front of your eyes. That's my opinion, at least.
Let me say this. Why is there this assumption that politicians must sit on the board of directors of GLCs? Who decided that politicians must sit on the board of directors of GLCs? The politicians themselves decided that. Originally, it was bureaucrats, and you also try to bring in professionals. And the professionals and the bureaucrats will have the know-how, the government side, the private side, you work together and you do what's in the interest of the GLCs. It's when politicians decided to plop themselves there too and decided that they themselves should get a director salary, which then went into the financing of politics, that we began to see the system going wrong. This is why I have been articulating for a long time. Keep the politicians out of the GLCs. And if you keep the politicians out of the GLCs and you leave it to the professionals and the bureaucrats who know exactly what the GLCs have been set up to do, then you will not see the abuse that we have been seeing.
All right. This side. It's
Hello.
like strategically positioned that you guys are going to ask the open.
Okay. Hello. My name is Naufal. I'm a recent graduate from IIU. My question is for Gov. If there is a revolving door problem where the executives in GLC can influence the laws that govern them, wouldn't any law that you're planning to implement be ineffective at the end?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the question. You see, this law is supposed to highlight the following. Number one, it's supposed to define the GLCs. Although what was mentioned by Prof. Terence just now has its own merit, but I will talk about it later. But this law is supposed to at least give us an indication about what the procurement of those GLCs would be on yearly basis. You know, they account for millions of ringgit every year, maybe even billions. So, you know, for example, if one GLC intends to buy a fleet of cars, that is public money, but we have no say whatsoever in it. So we don't know whether that goes to a Bumiputra, a non-Bumi, or even a non-Malaysian. There is no way for us to know all that, but with a law, at least there is a proper reporting, a proper governance, proper accountability, okay? So that every time when this, you know, in areas of procurement, there is a clear definition about how to go about this and how to go about for analysts such as myself to even understand where things are going. Okay?
All right, this side. Go ahead.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hi, my name is I'm a student of IIUM. I'm from Faculty of Economics or Kuliah of Economics, right? So this topic is very dear to me. I have a question for side opposition. So my question goes, adaptability is important in any situation, even in running a government, right, to ensure sustainability and also growth. If the politician is the problem, and it has been the problem for the past decades or even more since Najib's reign or even some part of Mahathir's reign, right? So should we also adapt to those changes and opt for more privatization?
War privatization.
Now, how do I address this question? Basically, what you're trying to talk about is leadership, political leadership. Who are the leaders? Here, I'd like to go back again in history. If you look at history and if you look at what we're dealing with here, Tun Abdul Razak, when he introduced the NEP, his vision was developmental. And Razak's vision of what the country needed at that time, I think, was correct. You needed active state intervention to deal with large-scale poverty, to talk about the rural-urban divide, to lift people out of poverty. Regional development was very important. He created the Ministry of Rural and Regional Development to do precisely that. He was quite correct in terms of how to go about doing the reforms. Then we have Mahathir. Mahathir comes along and he says, look, I like the fact that we should have government intervention, but I also actively support private capital. I actively support privatization. And he actively implemented it. Now let me pose one question to you, since you asked me this question. Name me today one GLC that was privatized during that period, which today is a major company. And please don't say Tenaga, Axiata and all that, because they are still GLCs. When we say privatization, it means taking complete ownership and control and putting it in the hands of a private businessman. Name me one. I'm not asking for 5, I'm not asking for 10, I'm asking for one. For that matter, anyone here, please help him. One. He's looking behind for help. There you are. Now, please don't laugh at him. It's not his fault. Because think as hard as you want, I can tell you now, you're going to have a problem finding one. Finding one. And you are telling me you want to privatize? I'm not saying that there's nobody out there who can't take these GLCs and make good of them. There may be. Give it to the right people. Do your research. Have an open system. See their plan. Is their business plan good? If it works, okay, I'll say go ahead. Okay, to be fair.
Okay.
Let me just say this before I close. There is one. There is one. Air Asia. Air Asia. Air Asia was in the dumps, burdened with debts. And they went to Mahathir and they said, I can turn it around. And Mahathir said, good. For RM1, take it. Look at Air Asia today. So this is not to say that there's absolutely none. I'm helping out the proposition. I'm helping them out. I'm helping you all out. But look, one. We had to struggle to find one. So be careful about what you are proposing. History is the great educator here. Learn from your history. Then you will know what better propositions you should make when you're trying to reform the economy.
All right, we're running out of time. One more question from that side, one more question from this side. Go.
Assalamualaikum. Hi, my name is Muhammad Fikri, and I'm a student here at IIUM. So, hi. So, I have a question for the government. So, Sister Hannah just now told us about she said that we don't need GLCs anymore because we have a lot of urban population. But one thing that she maybe forgot is that we have a very big case of urban poverty in which they receive wages above the poverty level, national poverty level, but not enough to support themselves here. So if we limit our dependency towards the GLCs, for example, like Mara and such, so how the government actually supposed to protect the citizens of its welfare? And yeah.
Okay.
I think it's important to note that we completely agree that GLCs do have their benefits. Essentially what Ops case is, GLCs were essentially supposed to help all of these people. Look at all the good GLCs have done. All of this is true. And that's precisely why we say limit. Because like Sir Firdaos already pointed to you, the reach of how GLCs are actually, they're like literally in every single industry, and oftentimes it's redundant. All I'm saying is that in a position in which it goes to that extent, that is when oftentimes a lot of the harms coming from side opposition enters. Things like, for example, politician appointment, etc. I do agree, there can exist certain GLCs to help these specific people, and there's no issue with that. But the problem is, when there is no way for us to regulate these GLCs, which is status quo, the issue is, who are we helping? We tend to help redundant people. We give money to redundant people, and that's precisely the issue. In order for us to get that kind of GLC again, is why we have to limit our dependency on them. Do you want to add?
That was very eloquent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Nothing to add?
Thank you.
Final question for this segment.
All right, my name is Arman. I'm a student in IIU. My question is is not contingent upon whether politicians exist in the board or not. My question is that if the purpose of a government is for you to create regulations and act as an oversight towards any corporations or private entities within the country, how does a government properly ensure that there is a sufficient and necessary oversight on these GLCs when there is a direct interest, inherent interest that the GLCs must be profitable for you to achieve all the benefits that you are telling me that GLCs are important for? For example, there are little regulations on Petronas or in oil and gas industry because the government has a direct interest in Petronas being successful because they employ Bumiputras, they give a large revenue, and government take a portion of it. So how can you say to me that oversight can actually exist and the oversight is proper?
When we have GLCs, what is very important is we must make a distinction between the regulatory side and the ownership side. The problem with the government was they mixed the two. And then you have a problem here. If the government is actively involved in these sectors of the economy, who is keeping an eye on the government? Now, this is why we said there is a problem with the current structure. I ended by saying the concept here we should look at is the concept of power. How does the system work? Where is the power concentrated? Do we have checks and balances in the system? We don't. One of the features of the Malaysian political system was the active concentration of economic and political power in the hands of the Prime Minister himself. That was why Najib could get away with whatever he did. Until we had the change of government, there was really nothing much we could do about this. This was our big problem entering into the last election. So here, how do we institute checks and balances? And this is why today we are talking about institutional reforms. Institutions such as Bank Negara, the Securities Commission, should be autonomous. And they should be accountable also to Parliament, not to the executive arm. And there should be select committees, oversight of these institutions. If the government is active in business, you must make sure that Parliament has great oversight over these institutions. You must make sure that the oversight institutions are independent and they have the autonomy to act even against those who are violating the GLCs to serve vested political interests. That system we do not have. And that is the reform I've been asking for of this government too.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for the House for throwing your questions to the debaters. Again, #YouthPower. We shall now move on to the third round of the debate, where we shall invite speakers from both sides to give their reply speeches. We shall start with side opposition to give their reply speech. It will be 4 minutes, Prof. And there will be no pure ice offered in this segment, so it's okay. Yeah, you won't lose marks there.
I'm glad there's no interruption for here. I have only 4 minutes. Let me be very clear. What we need to do is to stipulate very clearly what is the role of these GLCs. And here I want to break down the GLCs. What is the role of the GLICs? What is the role of the statutory bodies? What is the role of the trustee firms? And what is the role of the GLCs? And these four divisions that I mentioned, they do different things and allow them to do those different things. When it comes to the GLCs, if they're an impediment to helping enterprises grow, I'll say take them off, sell them off, divest them. But for the other three, I'll be very careful how we deal with them. Because come on, you don't want to get rid of EPF. EPF is your savings. And we need Khazanah. We need Khazanah as a sovereign wealth fund, and many countries have them. Sovereign wealth funds to go into strategic areas, to go into these sectors and help nurture domestic firms, because private firms will not go into the sectors because it is capital intensive and they probably just don't have the know-how to do it. Now, I am saying these things because, I want to mention this point because it has not come up yet. We talk so much of GLCs being this and being that, but do you know that 98% of the corporate sector are SMEs, small and medium scale enterprises? The real purpose of government intervention in the economy through these different institutions was precisely to help that 98%. The purpose of the GLCs is not to go and crowd out these companies, and I agree with them on that. The purpose of government intervention through these different agencies is to find ways and means to make sure these 98% of the corporate sector are dynamic enterprises which will create employment, be innovative, invest in R&D, and help take us up the technological ladder. That is a very important role for the government to do. Because as you know, the well-known phrase, we are stuck in the high middle income trap. We are not investing enough in R&D. That is true. The volume of investment in R&D in this country is very low. But do you know that R&D investment is very expensive? And R&D investment is very risky. Here again, the government can play a role in helping SMEs to invest in R&D so that they can innovate and take these companies forward and move up the technological ladder. There are such important things that this government must do with these agencies. We cannot just simply come here and say, get rid of them. Let the private sector run everything. And here I want to end with one important point. It was raised, the concept of the revolving door, and I thank the gentleman who raised it. If you want to privatize, who are you going to privatize to? And if you have a Bumiputra policy, which the government has in place, and they say you must privatize also the Bumiputras, who are these Bumiputras who have this money to take over these companies? Here again, we go back to history. History has shown when you want to do it, you go to the GLC banks, you abuse the GLC banks, give them the funding, and you privatize these companies. And what happens? When there's a crisis, there has to be a bailout. Secondly, let's assume that there are people there who have the money. Do you want to create oligarchies? Do you want to create very powerful people who have taken over our national assets and now become an economic powerhouse in their own right, who can use that economic power also to check the political system? Let's be very careful what we wish for. If we want to have reforms, the reforms must be interest of the nation and its people, not in the interest of private capitalists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We shall now invite the final speech of the House. Firdaos Rosli from side proposition.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Terence, for debating for us today. Let me start by saying this. From the historical perspective, GLCs definitely make sense. Since the 1960s, when we had our first Bumiputra Congress, even before 1969, there were three main objectives, or rather three main outcomes coming from that Bumiputra Congress. Number one, there must be a bank or financial institutions to help Bumiputra, particularly in rural-based industries. And as a result of that, we have Bank Bumiputra. Number two, there must be an institution to help Bumiputra to go for haji and etc. Again, we come up with Lembaga Urusan Tabung Haji, not Lembaga Tabung Haji, Urusan Tabung Haji. The word urusan here means that the sole objective of that organization is to ensure that Muslims, particularly Malay Muslims, have the opportunity to go haji and then one of the Rukun Islam. The third one is to ensure that there is a Baitul Mal. There is a proper zakat tithe institution that will help Bumiputra. Okay? And as a result of that, many other agencies, such as as mentioned by the opposition just now, like MARA, but MARA started even way before that, way before the Congress. It was called RIDA before that. Again, go back before the independence, when we had EPF. There were a very clear definition about what these institutions were supposed to do. When Tun Hussein On got power in a late 67, I think, 78. What happened was that he also introduced PNB, Pemodalan Nasional Berhad, to ensure that the wealth inequality among the races, particularly to Bumiputra, is being addressed. Also, he created Pernas, which now becomes, or rather is called PNS. See, the thing is, if I was to stretch the horizon, okay, from independence all the way until today, there are clear stages of GLCs. Yes, some are called GLCs. Yes, some called GLCs. Some are called stat bodies. Okay, but they are all governed by different acts. Yes, there is an act to govern them, but there is no one single act that governs all them together. Why we need this? Because there are GLCs that are not listed. There are also GLCs that have not even come up with an annual report. For example, Bernas. In fact, I don't think you can even access their website today. So the point that I'm making here is that where is the governance structure and where is the integrity, where is the accountability of these GLCs? I heard the word politicians heading GLCs, but are we saying that politicians cannot be professionals and professionals cannot be GLCs? If that's the case, then it makes sense for us to have ministers and deputy ministers without a proper degree. Hint, hint. So now the thing is, it doesn't matter who helm a GLC. The problem is that if it's a politician or if it's not a politician with a proper governance, okay, they will be accountable. How much they spend, how much control they have over the economy, how much control they have over influence as far as purchases are concerned. Those things are being addressed. With that, today, I'll go back to the statement of the day, which is to limit, not to eliminate, but to limit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that concludes the fourth IIUM Public Debate Series, co-organized by the Ministry of Youth and Sports and the International Islamic University Malaysia, as well as Astro Awani. Remember to catch this show on our website at astroawani.com, as well as download our app at the Google Play or the Apple App Store. Also, this show is going to be repeated a few times next week, or this week for that matter, by the time you watch this show on our channel at 501 Astro. Thank you very much for watching again. You have been watching Debat Awani. My name is Ibrahim Sani. Thanks very much for watching, and goodbye. Thank you. Prof.